As the midnight fog rolled thick over the winding mountain roads, Caleb adjusted his grip on the steering wheel. The clock on his dash blinked 2:57 a.m. in sickly green light. His truck was the only vehicle for miles, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was utterly alone up there, high in the Rockies. He tried the radio, but all he got was static. "Figures," he muttered, leaning forward as though his truck's headlights could pierce the suffocating darkness. Caleb was no stranger to long hauls. He had been a trucker for nearly 20 years, the open road his home and the night his friend. But tonight he felt uneasy. It had been this way since he left Colorado Springs. Maybe it was the strange fog that hung in patches like wisps of smoke, or maybe that last call with his wife Amy, replaying in his head, her voice trembling as she asked him to be careful. His fuel gauge dipped dangerously low, and he began scanning the darkness for any sign of civilization. Finally, a single flickering sign came into view, barely readable through the fog. Franklin's truck stop. It was a strange place to find a truck stop, but Caleb was too tired to be picky. He pulled off the road, gravel crunching under his tires as he parked near a rusty old gas pump. The place was deserted. The building looked more like an old diner, the windows dark and a faint, eerie glow seeping out around the edges. Just enough light to show peeling paint, shattered glass, and a weathered neon open sign hanging by a wire. "This is odd," he whispered, but fatigue and the thought of coffee pulled him from the truck. Inside, the place smelled like stale grease and something else, something metallic. A dim yellow bulb cast flickering shadows, and the only sound was the slow drip of a leaky faucet somewhere in the back. The counter stretched across the room, empty but for an old man leaning against it, watching Caleb with rheumy eyes. "Late night, huh?" the old man croaked, his voice thick with phlegm. "Yeah. Long haul?" Caleb replied, trying to keep it casual. "Any chance you got coffee?" The old man nodded slowly, but his eyes never left Caleb's. "Coffee, sure. Just be careful tonight. These roads, they're tricky." Caleb forced a smile, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Yeah, I know my way around," he said, hoping to end the conversation. The man's gaze was uncomfortable, unblinking. Without a word, the old man poured a cup of coffee and slid it across the counter. Caleb took it gratefully and found a booth near the window. The coffee was bitter, thick, and somehow sour, but he sipped it anyway, hoping the caffeine would wake him up. He looked outside, the fog swirling around his truck like it was alive, creeping up the windows in ghostly tendrils. Minutes passed, and just as Caleb was considering getting back on the road, he heard something. A faint, shuffling sound coming from outside. He turned his head slowly, his pulse quickening. Through the fog, he could barely make out the outline of a person standing by his truck. "Hey!" Caleb called, hoping his voice didn't betray his unease. No response. He squinted, and for a moment, he thought he saw the figure move, leaning against his truck as if peering inside. An icy dread settled over him. He shot a glance toward the old man, who was now wiping the counter with a dirty rag, but he was staring intently at Caleb, shaking his head in a slow, deliberate motion, as if warning him to stay put. "Forget it," Caleb muttered, reaching into his pocket for his keys. He wasn't going to sit here and wait for some creep to rob him or worse. He slid out of the booth and started for the door, but the old man's voice cut through the silence. "Don't go out there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Caleb stopped, turning to meet the old man's haunted eyes. "Look, man, I just need to get back on the road," he said. "I don't have time for—" The man held up a hand, silencing him. "There's things out here you don't want to meet, things that come with the fog. I've seen too many truckers stop here and never leave." Caleb hesitated, a shiver running down his spine. The man's voice had a strange edge to it, like he was speaking from some dark memory. "Listen, I don't know what game you're playing, but I have a job to do," Caleb said, his voice faltering. The old man simply shook his head, his eyes glassy with an emotion Caleb couldn't place. "It's not a game. Whatever's out there, it's hungry." Without another word, Caleb pushed through the door, his heart pounding. Outside, the fog was thicker than ever, coiling around his legs like a living thing. He reached his truck, glancing around for any sign of the figure he'd seen, but the lot was empty, silent except for the faint hiss of wind through the trees. As he unlocked the door, a voice whispered, close to his ear, barely audible but unmistakably real. "Don't leave." Caleb spun around, but there was no one there, just an impenetrable wall of fog. His hands were shaking now, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He scrambled into the truck and slammed the door, locking it with trembling fingers. He forced himself to breathe, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. But then, he felt it. A presence in the back of the cab. Cold fingers seemed to brush the nape of his neck, and a sickly sweet smell filled the air. It smelled like rot, like old blood. Slowly, he looked in the rearview mirror. There, sitting in the shadows, was a figure. A gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile, his skin sallow and stretched tight over his bones. He leaned forward, his mouth opening in a slow, gruesome smile. "Didn't I tell you not to leave?" Caleb's scream was strangled, frozen in his throat. He could see the figure's face, pale and waxy, a ghastly grin twisting its mouth. The figure moved closer, filling the tiny cab with a suffocating presence, its breath cold against Caleb's cheek. "You took the road, didn't you? The road that never ends." The voice was barely a whisper, but Caleb felt it in his bones, deep and dark. "You drive and drive, but it won't let you leave. You belong to the fog now." With every ounce of strength he had left, Caleb fumbled for his keys and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he floored it, the truck lurching forward into the thick fog. His heart thundered as he sped down the winding road, praying that somehow, some way, he could escape whatever nightmare he had stumbled into. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. The fog lifted as the sun began to rise, bathing the mountains in a pale, ghostly light. Caleb's breath slowed, and he risked a glance in the rearview mirror. There was nothing there, just empty seats, his weary reflection staring back at him, but in the pit of his stomach, he knew he hadn't escaped. Somewhere, deep in the fog-draped mountains, something was still waiting, and it was only a matter of time before it found him again. The road was quiet and empty, stretching endlessly beneath the moonlight as Ron's headlights cut through the night. His latest load had taken him out to a lonely stretch of highway he'd never traveled before, and he cursed his dispatcher for sending him down such a desolate path. It felt like he was driving through nowhere, the horizon melting into darkness. His radio sputtered, picking up occasional bursts of static, but no music, no voices, just static and the hum of his engine. Ron was used to night hauls and the eerie quiet that came with them, but something about tonight felt wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that there was something lurking just beyond the edge of the light, hidden in the shadows of the desert. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and he jumped, almost losing control of the wheel. There was someone in the back of his truck. He could see them. Just for a second, a figure crouched low behind his seat, hidden in the darkness. His heart pounded as he whipped his head around, scanning the truck's empty interior. There was no one there, just his rumpled jacket slung over the seat. "Calm down, Ron," he muttered to himself, his voice shaking. But as he faced forward, he heard it, a low, wheezing breath coming from the back. Slowly, painfully slowly, he looked into the mirror again, and this time he saw her face. Pale, hollow eyes, lips drawn back in a wide, toothy grin. A woman, or something that looked like one, with a skeletal frame and skin that hung loosely like it barely clung to her bones. She was watching him, unblinking, her head cocked at an unnatural angle. He slammed his foot on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop on the side of the road. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the wheel. He didn't dare look in the mirror again, terrified of what he might see. His breaths came in gasps as he squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to wake up from this nightmare. After a few moments, he cracked one eye open. There was no one there, just his empty truck, the cab silent and still. "Just your mind playing tricks on you," he whispered, trying to steady his breathing. But as he reached for the gear shift, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. The fingers were skeletal, icy, pressing down with a weight that didn't belong to anything human. "Why did you stop?" a voice whispered, so close to his ear that he felt the icy breath on his skin. He gasped and looked up, finding himself staring directly into the rearview mirror. She was there again, closer this time, her face inches from his own, her wide grin frozen in place, eyes staring straight into his soul. "Drive," she whispered, her voice cracking and brittle, like old, dry leaves scraping against each other. He felt paralyzed, her cold fingers still digging into his shoulder. Her eyes bore into him, unblinking, her grin growing wider, stretching impossibly until her mouth was an inhuman, gaping void. He could feel her breath now, cold and sour, filling the cab. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. But something in him, some primal instinct, kicked in and he yanked the wheel to the side, throwing the door open and tumbling out onto the road. He scrambled to his feet, running as fast as he could away from the truck, away from the ghostly figure still watching him from inside. Ron didn't stop running until he reached a small diner a mile down the road, his legs shaking, heart pounding. He stumbled through the doors, his face pale, his breath coming in short gasps. A few truckers sat around the counter, sipping coffee and staring at him with raised eyebrows. The waitress came over, her expression concerned. "You all right, hon?" she asked, her voice soft. Ron opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. He was still shaking, still feeling the ice-cold grip of that hand on his shoulder. The waitress set a cup of coffee in front of him, her brow furrowing. "You look like you've seen a ghost." He didn't respond, staring blankly at the steaming cup. His hands were trembling as he lifted it to his lips, the warmth barely reaching through his numb fingers. After a few moments, he managed to speak. I saw someone in my truck. A woman. She was. The other truckers exchanged uneasy glances, and one of them leaned over, his face grim. "You came down the old canyon road, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Ron nodded, feeling a chill creep over him again. The man sighed, his face lined with something that looked like sorrow. "You're not the first. They say a woman died on that road years ago. Hitchhiker. Found her body weeks later. They say she still wanders there, waiting for a ride." Ron shook his head, unable to believe it, even though he'd seen it with his own eyes. No, it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The man shrugged, his eyes dark and tired. Real or not, a lot of drivers see her. Some of them never make it back. Silence settled over the diner, the other truckers staring into their coffee as though they could forget whatever horrors lay waiting in the dark. Ron finished his coffee, his hands still trembling, the memory of that skeletal hand lingering on his shoulder, the icy whisper echoing in his ears. He decided to leave his truck at the diner and catch a ride with another driver. Whatever was out there on the old canyon road, he wasn't going back to find out. On the final stretch of his route, Marvin's rig hummed along the dark, empty highway that cut through the heart of the Mojave Desert. It was a route he'd taken countless times, but tonight felt different. The sky was moonless, the stars barely piercing the blackness. The stillness felt oppressive, like something lurking just out of sight. His clock flashed 3:12 a.m. as he checked his side mirrors. Empty, not another set of headlights for miles. But then, his CB radio crackled to life. "Hey, anyone out there?" a voice asked, low and shaky. Marvin was startled. He hadn't heard anything on the radio for hours. "Yeah, I'm here. You all right, buddy?" A pause, and then, "You see her too?" Marvin's hand tightened on the wheel. "See who?" Another pause. Then the voice crackled through again, tinged with desperation. "The girl. She's been walking along the side of the road for miles now, keeping pace with my truck. I don't know what to do." Marvin's heart skipped a beat. He scanned the road ahead, focusing his eyes on the shoulder, but it was empty. He felt a creeping sense of dread clawing its way up his spine. "Where are you right now?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "Junction 22. About 3 miles past the old motel ruins. She's still there, watching me." The voice broke off, muffled by static. "You see her too, right?" Marvin's stomach tightened. He knew Junction 22 well, and he'd passed that old motel hours ago. "I'm ahead of you, partner. Haven't seen anyone." A long, static-filled silence filled the radio, then the voice came through again, weaker, frightened. "You? Sure? She's been walking alongside the truck this whole time, just staring at me." Marvin swallowed, gripping the wheel tighter. "Listen, just stay calm, all right? Sometimes these roads do funny things at night." He didn't quite believe his own words. He kept his eyes glued to the mirrors, his gut telling him he didn't want to see what the other driver was seeing. But curiosity got the better of him, and he glanced over his shoulder at the empty highway. And that's when he saw her. A young girl, maybe 12 or 13, dressed in a torn white dress that flapped in the wind. Her hair was tangled, her skin pale, almost blue, with dark shadows beneath her eyes. She was staring straight at him as she walked, her hollow gaze fixed on him with unsettling intensity. Marvin's heart thudded, and he jerked the wheel, nearly sending his truck off the road. She wasn't supposed to be there. No one should have been able to keep up with a rig moving at 50 miles an hour. He snapped his gaze back to the road, breathing hard, his hands slick on the wheel. The voice crackled through the radio again, frantic now. She's smiling now. That wasn't there before. Oh God, she's smiling. Marvin's skin crawled as he dared to glance out the window again. Sure enough, the girl's expression had shifted, her lips stretching into a wide, unnatural grin that seemed to cut across her face. Her eyes were dark pits, glistening with malice. "Speed up," Marvin muttered, his voice shaky. "Get out of there. Just floor it." The voice on the other end was choked with fear. "I already did. I'm at 70, and she's still there. She's keeping up." Marvin's heart raced as he pressed his foot harder on the gas, pushing his truck faster, hoping to leave the girl behind. But when he looked back, she was still there, gliding effortlessly alongside the truck, her eyes fixed on him, that horrible grin growing wider and wider until it seemed to tear her face in two. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The road was empty again, just as silent and desolate as before. Marvin's breath came in gasps, and he had to steady himself, his pulse hammering in his ears. He glanced at his CB radio, waiting for the other driver's voice, but there was only silence. "Hey, you there?" He called out, his voice shaking. Nothing. He waited a few more seconds, then tried again. "Do you copy? Is she gone?" But no answer came. Marvin's skin crawled as he realized the horrifying truth. He'd been hearing that voice for hours, but he hadn't seen a single other truck on the road. Had the other driver ever really been there at all? And then, without warning, his CB crackled to life once more, filling his cab with static before a faint, chilling whisper slid through the speaker. "She's right behind you." Marvin froze, his blood running cold. His hands shook as he forced himself to look into the rearview mirror. The girl was standing there, inside his truck, just behind his seat. Her face was inches from his, her eyes like empty voids, her grin twisted into something monstrous. And as he stared, unable to breathe, she leaned forward, her voice a cold whisper in his ear. "Keep driving, or I'll never let you leave." Marvin's scream filled the cab, but out on the empty highway there was no one to hear it. The rain poured down in heavy sheets as Gus's truck barreled down the isolated back roads of Montana. He had taken a shortcut through the mountains, hoping to make up for lost time after his last delivery ran late. The headlights of his rig barely pierced the downpour, and the winding, muddy road was getting harder to navigate with each mile. He was alone out there, and something about that isolation weighed on him in a way he couldn't shake. The darkness was so dense it almost seemed alive, swallowing the world outside his windshield. He flipped on the high beams just as his radio crackled with an eerie burst of static. "Help! Help me!" Gus froze, his hand tightening on the wheel. The voice was faint, distorted, almost like a whisper. He reached for the radio, hesitant. "Who's out there?" he asked, his voice low and uneasy. Silence followed, save for the static hissing faintly. He waited, heart pounding, glancing out the rain-streaked windows. The darkness around him felt endless, swallowing the road and the trees on either side. "Please, I'm lost. Please." The voice crackled through again, and this time Gus felt a cold shiver run down his spine. It was a woman's voice, breathy, almost as if she were struggling to speak. He leaned forward, pressing the button to reply. "Where are you?" he asked, scanning the empty road as if expecting to see someone. "I'm driving through the mountains near White Pine. Are you nearby?" There was no answer, only static. Gus shook his head, blaming it on exhaustion. Long hauls could do that to a person, make you hear things, see things. Just as he let go of the button, a shape appeared in his headlights, a pale, shivering figure standing in the middle of the road. He slammed on the brakes, his truck skidding on the wet asphalt as he swerved to avoid her. His heart pounded as he fought to bring the rig to a stop, the tires skidding until he finally came to a halt just a few feet from where she stood. Gus took a deep breath, shaking off the shock, and grabbed his flashlight before opening the door. The rain was cold and relentless as he stepped out, the beam of his flashlight catching the girl's face. She was young, maybe 20, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes wide and glassy. She wore a thin dress that was soaked through, clinging to her frail frame. She looked half dead, pale as a ghost. "You all right?" he called out, but she didn't respond. She just stared at him, her lips quivering as she shivered in the rain. "Come on, let's get you out of the rain," he said, reaching out to guide her toward his truck. She didn't move. Her eyes flicked to his hand, and she took a step back, her face twisting into an expression of terror. "Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the downpour. Don't, don't leave me out here. Gus frowned, confused. I'm not leaving you. I'm trying to help you. But her expression only grew more fearful, her eyes darting to something over his shoulder, staring at it with a look of sheer terror. Don't let him get me, she whispered. Gus turned, scanning the empty road, but there was no one there. Just darkness and rain. Who are you talking about? He asked, feeling the chill sink into his bones. But when he turned back, she was gone, vanished as if she had never been there. He backed up, looking around in the rain, calling out into the darkness. But there was nothing. No sound except the rain hitting the asphalt, no sign that anyone had been standing there just moments before. He climbed back into his truck, locking the door and trying to shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As he settled back into his seat, his radio crackled to life again. You let her go. You let her get away. The voice was low and hoarse, filled with anger. Gus's heart raced as he looked at the radio, but he didn't answer. His hand trembled as he reached for the ignition, eager to put as much distance between himself and that voice as possible. But just as he turned the key, something cold touched his arm. He looked down, and there she was, sitting in the passenger seat, her wide eyes staring into his with an expression of utter dread. Please, he's coming, she whispered. Gus recoiled, almost falling out of his seat. What are you? Before he could finish, a dark shape appeared in his rearview mirror. A figure standing behind the truck, half hidden in the shadows. The rain seemed to swirl around him, his outline barely visible. He could see a hint of a face, eyes dark and hollow, watching them from the night. Gus's blood ran cold as the figure took a step closer, disappearing from view behind the truck. Go! The girl hissed, her voice rising in panic. You have to drive now! Gus didn't need to be told twice. He hit the gas, his tires screeching as he pulled back onto the road, the headlights illuminating the rain-soaked pavement. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror, but the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness behind him. For a few miles, silence filled the truck, broken only by the sound of the rain against the windshield. Gus dared a glance over at the girl, but her gaze was fixed straight ahead, her face pale and hollow. Who was that? He finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. She didn't answer, her eyes glazed over, staring at something far away. Miss, who are you running from? He asked again, trying to keep his voice steady. Finally, she turned to him, her face twisted with sorrow. I thought I'd escaped him, but he always finds me. He found me once on this very road. I tried to get away, but he caught up. Gus swallowed, feeling a chill settle over him. Who is he? She looked at him, her eyes filled with a terror that seemed boundless. He's the one who never stops chasing, the one who follows even after you think you've left him behind. And now he's coming for you too. Gus felt his stomach drop as he glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was there again, closer this time, illuminated briefly in the red glow of his taillights. It was moving fast, gaining on them, almost as if it were floating. Without thinking, Gus pressed the accelerator harder, the truck speeding through the rain-soaked darkness. But no matter how fast he went, the figure drew closer, its shadowy form looming in the mirrors. The girl looked at him, her eyes wide, and said, It's too late. He's already here. And with that, she vanished, leaving only the damp, icy chill where she'd been sitting moments before. Gus kept driving, his knuckles white as he clutched the wheel, the shadow still chasing him down that dark, endless road, whispering to him from the darkness with a voice that promised he would never be alone again. The clock on the dashboard ticked past 2:45 a.m. as Eddie's rig rolled along the remote stretches of Route 50, famously called the loneliest road in America. He'd been warned about strange things happening along this highway, but Eddie had always brushed it off as trucker lore. Still, tonight was different. His headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the road ahead seemed to stretch into a void. Every so often, he thought he saw something just beyond his lights. Movement on the shoulder, shadows crossing the road, but whenever he looked closer, there was nothing there. He felt a chill crawl up his spine and decided to turn up the heat, adjusting the vents to blow directly on him. But the warmth did little to settle his nerves. It felt as if something was watching him, something hidden just outside the halo of his lights. He switched on his CB radio, hoping to catch another trucker's voice, but the static that filled his cab was thick and eerie, crackling louder than usual. Suddenly, a voice broke through the static. Hello? Anyone out there? Eddie's heart skipped. It sounded like a young woman's voice, thin and scared. I hear you, he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Are you okay? There was silence, then a faint response. I'm lost. Can you help me? Eddie frowned. This stretch of road was desolate. There hadn't been a town or gas station for miles. Who would be out here alone in the middle of the night? Where are you? He asked, scanning the empty road. More static crackled through before the voice replied, sounding closer this time. I don't know. It's so dark here. Can you please find me? A cold prickle crept over Eddie. He wanted to help, but something about the situation felt off. He tried reasoning with himself. Maybe she was stranded. Maybe her car broke down. All right, he said, keeping his tone calm. Just keep talking and I'll try to find you. What's around you? Her voice trembled. There's a car in the ditch, and there's him. Eddie's stomach tightened. Who's him? The static surged, louder than before, and for a moment he thought he heard something else, a raspy, shallow breathing. He's watching me, the voice whispered, barely audible. He's been following me. I can't escape him. He's waiting. Eddie's heart was hammering now, his hands slick on the steering wheel. He felt trapped, like he'd stumbled into something he didn't understand, something beyond the ordinary. His headlights illuminated a figure up ahead, standing by the side of the road. He slowed the truck, peering out the windshield. It was a woman in a thin, pale dress, her hair hanging over her face, soaked from the rain he hadn't noticed was falling. She didn't wave him down, didn't signal for help. She just stood there, staring at him with empty, hollow eyes. He brought the truck to a stop, swallowing his fear. He rolled down the window just a crack. Are you all right, miss? He called out. Her eyes slowly met his, and she tilted her head in a way that sent a chill through his bones. You didn't find me in time. What? He stammered, gripping the wheel tighter. He was faster. He found me first. The words were barely more than a whisper, her voice strangely distant, like she was speaking from somewhere else entirely. Before he could respond, she turned and began to walk down the road, her footsteps slow and deliberate, disappearing into the darkness. A soft, steady tapping started on his passenger side window. Eddie froze, his heart nearly stopping. He hadn't seen anyone approach, hadn't heard footsteps. The tapping continued, rhythmic and cold. He forced himself to turn, his eyes moving to the window. A hand pressed against the glass. A man's hand, large and pale, with fingers that looked wrong, twisted like they'd been broken and reset poorly. He could barely make out a face through the rain-slicked window, a dark, gaping mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too wide. The man outside leaned closer, his eyes gleaming with a malevolent hunger, the grin widening until it looked as though his face might split. Eddie's skin went ice cold as the man mouthed something against the glass, his breath fogging up the window. Leave her be. She's mine. With that, the figure stepped back, fading into the shadows just as a lightning flash lit up the road. Eddie caught a glimpse of the man's form as it melted into the darkness, leaving only the faint outline of handprints on the window. Panicking, Eddie hit the gas, his truck roaring down the road as he put as much distance as he could between himself and whatever he'd just encountered. The CB crackled again, the woman's voice echoing in his cab, softer now, as if she were slipping away. You couldn't save me. No one can. He's out here, always, waiting. Then, silence. Eddie drove for hours without stopping, heart racing, the handprints still visible on his window, faintly glowing in the moonlight. He never saw the woman again, never heard the voice on the radio, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still watching, waiting just beyond the reach of his headlights, waiting to be found by the next poor soul who dared stop. He avoided Route 50 after that, but he heard whispers among the truckers, stories of a woman's voice calling for help, of drivers stopping for her only to meet a figure lurking in the shadows. Some said they'd seen her. Others claimed it was just a ghost story. But Eddie knew better. He never looked too closely at empty roads again, and every now and then he thought he heard it, the faintest whisper of her voice crackling through his radio, calling out for help in the dead of night.